Yes, so we are live.
Okay, cool. I start, right? All right. Hi all. I'm very sorry. I have to get used to this because I'm seeing myself on Zoom, and I know I'm also live on YouTube, so it's a bit weird. But I am going to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Julie KLINGER. But first, I just want to say that you can comment on our YouTube chat, and then I will read the comments out loud. And I also wanted to say that I'm very sad that we are not in Telciu and we can't see each other face to face. But it was really nice to be able to see some of you online and then chat even on YouTube. So it kind of felt like we are almost together. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this year so I can introduce to you my newborn daughter. But I can't now, but so it stays for next year. So yeah, our keynote speaker this year is the amazing Julie KLINGER, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware. And we have been fortunate enough to have her last year at the Telciu Summer School, where she held a seminar on natural resource frontiers, territory, and ethno-national others, based on her research and book entitled Rare Earth Frontiers from Terrestrial Subsoils to Lunar Landscapes. And this unfolded geographies of extractions, where we were introduced to the so-called rarity of some minerals used for sustainable technologies, as they were mobilized by state and imperial power structures against the autonomy and livelihood security of ethno-national others, without this rarity being actually explained by geological incidents. She had an amazingly detailed fieldwork and knowledge of the frontier spaces where such raw materials come from. And this painted a grim picture of extractions of raw materials used for so-called sustainable futures, asking whether decarbonization would actually mean decoloniality. She's one of those really cool scholars whose dedications to bringing the rarely visible, racialized, uneven geopolitics of resource extraction to light is paired with a singular kindness and attentiveness and care towards the people around her, an attitude that at least I believe is needed to decolonize and rebuild our relations to each other, our institutions and spaces. And this is something that we have also been trying to do with more or less success in Telciu. And if we talk about building social movements when no one has time, I want to have a shout out to Anastasia Opera and Adina Mocanu, and all the other organizers who managed to make this happen in an online edition in this context with all its hardships and everything. And I know it has not been an easy task. With that in mind, I am very much looking forward to hear Julie's keynote on where and how to decolonize the revolutionary movements, a few insights about social practices of commoning and decolonization. So Julie, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much to the organizers for all the work that you've done to make this happen. I will say before we get into things that I'm in the quietest possible space that I can be in, but there may be sometimes some ambulances outside. If that does happen, I will just mute, hold up my finger like this, and we'll know we're just waiting for a couple of seconds for the noise to die down. Okay, so I will go ahead here and share my screen with you. All right, excellent. And you are now seeing the title slide for my keynote, correct? All right. Okay, so before we begin, or really just as a beginning, I'll say that the title of the talk is Where and How to Decolonize Revolutionary Movements. And I'll offer you the best answer that I can at the beginning, because this talk is going to cover a lot of ground. So it's about time, it's about space, it's about relations. It begins with what we do with each hour of our day. The question of, for whom do we labor? What does this labor then do to the earth, to non-human living beings, and our relationships to each other? Does our labor continue to force the antagonism between production and reproduction, or does our labor instead dissolve this antagonism? I think the most compelling examples of decolonization occur in a sort of asymmetry to the very structures that we're struggling against. And by that, I mean, the most compelling examples of decolonization that I have seen have been very local, very specific, embodied examples of the practice of commoning, right? And this commoning is simultaneously a practice of opening, of reclaiming, and also of certain kinds of exclusions. And you're already doing this, hence the photo from Telciu, August 2019. Commoning strives for a very messy ideal. We know it is always partial. I think the easier way to do this talk would be to tell you a series of stories about commoning, of the ways in which people are surviving in the ruins of contemporary techno-capitalism and industrial and post-industrial society, and the way that people are creating beauty in this apocalyptic environment. All of my examples of commoning involve physical spaces, embodied practices, but they also are discontinuous, transnational, and transspatial. All of the practices involve not only relations between people, but between people, animals, plants, soils, and various physical earth systems, such as the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. So the example that I'm showing you here is a cooperative movement that that many of us have been involved in since the COVID pandemic. This is a practice that's built around encouraging people to garden. It was inspired by the World War II Victory Gardens movement in the United States. But it's built on providing mutual aid, co-sheltering, and also getting people to reclaim some of that sweet, sweet sovereignty that comes when you grow your own food. Right, so the infrastructure for the Cooperative Gardens Commission in the United States grew directly out of the social and political organizational infrastructure that was created during the 2011 Occupy movement, right? And so this is what commoning, and this is what this movement of food sovereignty and support looks like in practice. We're repurposing garbage. Right, we're planting in yogurt containers, we're sharing seeds, we're being mindful of the soil that we use. And we're making small distributions in a COVID safe manner. And I want to pause on this image right here, because I think, you know, if we think about the enormity of the system that we're struggling against, right, we're talking about trying to survive in multiple crises created by climate change, by fossil-fueled capitalism, by certain political economic model that's built on violence. And this action of passing seedlings from hand to hand can seem just so small, right, in relation to all of that. But built within this is a whole series of possibilities and powers, right, that sometimes look like this, other times they look like this, right? But here we have imagery from the Occupy movement in 2011, which is responsible actually for connecting tens of thousands of people in this country to gardening resources. Now, here's what these movements have in common, right? Whether we're talking about Occupy, or if we're talking about various seed sharing movements. These local practices of commoning meet subsistence and care needs by redistributing what's normally enclosed surpluses, right? They provide sustenance, they provide joy and contention. They often occur in the ruins or in the interstices of urban capitalist systems. And also, more importantly, they didn't emerge from nowhere, right? It's always possible to create beauty and to sustain life in the ruins. I think another thing too that we need to bear in mind, and many veterans of social movements know this, right, is that the true scope of the impact appears so small in the moment. It can really only be understood in retrospect. And to that, I would add that the true enormity of the impact is difficult to be known for those who are both within and outside of these different movements. These sorts of movements for commoning more broadly, they're likely to be endlessly ridiculed and derided by people who weren't there and people who weren't actually invested, but are perhaps louder, right? And also I'm echoing Deepesh Chakrabarty here in his 1992 piece in Defense of the Fragment, where he's talking about violence, right? These practices of commoning will likely be excluded from the quote unquote real history of the early 21st century, much in the way that practices of commoning in previous centuries have often been excluded from the quote unquote real history of previous centuries of change and development. All right. Now, there's a couple of other things I'd like to say. First, the lessons from all of this are really quite clear, right? No magical charm was created was necessary to create the space for commoning. And I will say, just as an aside, when we were first discussing the theme for this conference back in January, that was before the COVID pandemic really hit in the Americas. I was anticipating being able to tell you a story of how the Yanomami indigenous people I had been working with had perhaps won their autonomy over their lands, that their strategies had worked. I was expecting to be able to tell you about how environmental activists and artisanal miners in tropical Africa were using the commons of outer space and outer space-based technology to reclaim their territorial rights and to defend the integrity of their lands and bodies, right? As I mentioned, this was in January, before we went into a sort of worldwide slowdown. But I will say that having reduced the carbon footprint of my research and fieldwork has forced me to focus with greater depth on other sorts of practices and their implications. So that brings us to the task at hand, right? Our task is to place social movements, spiritualities, and commoning on the same plane of theory and practice. And this is really hard. This is really difficult to do. And I applaud the organizers for the provocation to do so. I'll start with a sort of short story that I think serves as a parallel for what we've been doing here these days, and hopefully will continue to do going forward. In Berlin in 2013, the post-colonial theorist Deepesh Chakrabarty delivered a keynote speech that wasn't necessarily about the themes of his earlier work, but it was actually primarily about climate change. Right? Now, the audience was really mixed in their reaction to his talk, right? Some didn't really like it because they wanted to hear him say his piece about subaltern studies and post-colonial theory and the defense of the fragment. And others didn't really like it because they hadn't connected the dots between, critical theory and climate change. And mostly because they were just unaccustomed to talking about climate change in the context of their work and scholarship. And so this seemed to kind of come out of nowhere. But Chakrabarty did this in 2013 because in his view, which I agree with, history had forced the conversation. Now the excerpt that I'd like to direct your attention to from his 1992 paper is here at the bottom of the page. And I'll give you a moment just to read that on your own. Right. I think we have presented ourselves with a comparable challenge here. This means that we're trying to rise to the occasion that history has put before us in an era of resurgent fascism that's wrapped up with right-wing evangelical movements in different countries around the world. Now, I'm a specialist, as Ágota said, in natural resource extraction and frontiers. And I'm not at all comfortable talking about spirituality, but I think that history has forced the conversation, and so we need to do it, right? This is the basis of my knowledge about the relationship between land and spirituality and coloniality. You're looking at a winter landscape of my grandfather's farm in northern Illinois. Now, I think if we are to dismantle the imperial machine, we have to first harness our power as imperial and neoliberal subjects in order to find each other, which this workshop makes possible. Now, for my part, this has enabled me to not only be born and grow up in a place like this, but also to live and work and learn with communities in frontier regions of China and Brazil. It's this specific place that you're looking at. These are my roots, and I had to escape them first in the rural Midwest in order to develop the language to understand the multiple systems of which it is a part, spatial systems, temporal systems. I had to leave this place in order to develop the consciousness to critique the systems that created it, and also to develop the compassion to understand why people in this place work so hard to perpetuate something that is hurting them and hurting the planet. All right. Now, the purpose of this conference is that we compare notes and strategies. And as we're enmeshed in multiple systems that are designed to isolate and alienate us from ourselves, our histories, and our bodies and each other, we have to find each other however we can. And so the stories that I'm sharing with you today are from all over the world, but as your very own Professor Manuela Boazza has written, the predicaments of rural Transylvania, which are situated at the crossroads of several imperial geographies, are structurally comparable with those of other multilingual and inter-imperial locales, such as Taiwan, the Philippines, the Caribbean, and India. So even in these inter-imperial locales, people create conditions for their own freedom, for love, beauty, knowledge, pleasure, and sustainability. Now let's dive right into it and talk about different sorts of spiritualities. I've already stated I'm no authority on spiritual matters, and certainly my early life spirituality makes me politically suspect because it is an inescapable artifact of the aftermath of indigenous genocide and the settler colonial context of very fertile soils in the Midwestern United States. And the cosmopolitanism of my career reveals my position as an imperial subject. And of course, there's some shame here. I think that this shame is informative. As a critical left scholar, there's some part of me that views this professed focus on the spiritual as a marker of some sort of self-absorption, of decadence, of delusion. And what's even more troublesome here is that I'm drawing on my own experience to maybe offer some generalizable insights. And so I'm running the risk of generalizing or universalizing my particular experience, which is a marker of spiritualities that are defined within organized religions that are built on proselytizing. But I think the stakes of this sort of uncomfortable inventory are precisely decolonizing revolutionary movements and possibilities, which is to say, the stakes are whether or not we can win this time around, maybe, or continue our victories where we have them. So these kinds of inventories are essential, but insufficient. So let this be one step. So I, like many others here, have an allergic reaction to the term spirituality, right? So what the hell is a spirit anyway? I tend to agree with Marx's analysis, and here I provide his quote in context. I'll give you a chance to read that on your own. Now, it's the last sentence in particular that I think is quite important. The criticism of religion is, therefore, an embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears for which religion is the halo. Now, often I think people tend to be alienated by critiques of religion because of this failure to parse between organized religion and internal life or spirituality. And in fact, what is abundantly clear for us now is that the virulent symbiosis of religious fundamentalism, millenarianism, and right-wing fascist politics shows that the abolition of religion as a political goal really backfires dangerously. And I think that this is precisely because of a lack of clarity or a lack of separation between the oppressive institutions of organized religion and the immeasurable dimensions of one's interior life. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this question, of the difference between religion and spirituality. right? So there's the religion that Marx critiqued. And then on the other hand, there's the spirituality that refers to the immeasurable dimensions of one's interior life, right? And also confusing matters further is the sort of quote unquote spirituality that's been commodified and sold as, I guess, to put a sort of contemporary neoliberal twist on Marx's characterization, as an opiate that enables one to disengage from quote unquote the masses, of which we are a part and with which our fates are inextricably intertwined. So maybe when we're talking about spiritualities, it might be helpful to set aside the term spiritual because it's so troublesome and so often confused with organized religion, and instead maintain engagement with the core concept and call it instead interior life. Right? We recognize that interior life is intangible, and we can assign any spatio-temporal dimensionality to it that we choose. But we also recognize that interior life is material and embodied and socially produced, right? There's no neat boundary actually between internal life and external social relations, except one is material and can be seen by others, and the other is internal and difficult to measure. And because of this, we have to contend with the beliefs that move us toward and against each other, not as a tangent, right, but actually as essential to the material, social, and political economic questions with which I think most of us are more conventionally engaged. Interior life requires some sort of social context in order to be well and whole. You know, even if that social context is precarious and dangerous, and even if that feeling of wholeness comes once for an instant in one's mortal life. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what this might reveal about subject formation at the intersection of settler colonialism, religion, and the legacies of imperialism that enable the wandering neoliberal cosmopolitanists that many of us geographers and even critical geographers are. This is uncomfortable for me, so I'd just like to say, if you'd like to get up, get a beer, get a coffee, now might be a good time, but you don't have to. I offer this really brief discussion to show you, or more to invite similar reflections, right? This is a lesson in discomfort, and in discomfort, there is incredible information. So as I mentioned, I was raised in the middle United States as a Presbyterian. Presbyterians played an important role in settler colonialism. So like Joanna Mariana and others, I will also be quoting Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in her really important work. Here it says that Presbyterians regarded themselves as chosen people of the covenant, commanded by God to go into the wilderness and build a new Israel. The Scots-Irish also saw themselves, as their descendants see themselves, as the true and authentic patriots entitled to the land through their blood sacrifice. The blood spilled was largely indigenous, right? So in her discussion of how sacred land through enclosure becomes real estate, the author continues that the land won through North American bloodshed was not necessarily conceived in terms of particular parcels for a farm that would be passed down through generations. Most of the settlers who fought for it kept moving on nearly every generation. So that kind of gives a little bit of a lie to the term settlers. Settlers are unrooted people, right? And as someone who's spent the better part of her adult life not living in a single particular place, and only now re-engaging with the earth in a meaningful way, the term settlers may be a little bit misleading. But anyway, she continues. Most of the settlers who fought for it kept moving on nearly every generation. In the South, many lost their holdings to land companies that then sold it to planters seeking to increase the size of their slave-worked plantations. So without the unpaid forced labor of enslaved Africans, a farmer growing cash crops could not compete on the market. Once in the hands of settlers, the land itself was no longer sacred, as it had been for the indigenous. It became private property, every man a possible king. So she goes on to say, and I think this is really important and why I quote this at length here. I'll give you a chance to read this on your own. Right. what this ethos of settling and land and commodification, what it looks like actually in its spatial form. And so when we're thinking about commoning or recommoning in the context of our actual physical environments, this is what we're contending with, right? This particular spatial pattern for many of us, right? So these were then the unseen, these were then the settlers upon which the national ideal was based. I'm sorry, there's a little, there we go. And even as these settlers themselves perpetrated acts of mass violence, they were also the ultimately dispensable cannon fodder, right, for building empire, right? So those who died fighting in foreign wars were said to have sacrificed their lives to protect, quote unquote, this land that the old settlers had spilled blood to acquire. And it bears repeating, the blood spilled was largely indigenous. Right, so it was the land that was cleared by these settlers that created the New World and the land of opportunity for my family, which fled from Germany in the late 1800s because they refused to serve in Kaiser Wilhelm's army. And they have now farmed Northern Illinois for 4 generations. Of course, I had to leave the place to learn this history, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Now, a little bit more on my own biography. There's about 3 more minutes of this. So as an adolescent, I was confused by the world and really thirsting for answers. And so I threw myself into religious studies and to the most welcoming institution that was available, which was the Evangelical Church, which I joined with my father and my stepmother. I mean, I really loved the dogmatic certainty and the energy of evangelical fervor. I was convinced that I wanted to go to divinity school to make it my life's work to save souls, to spread the gospels. Then by chance, I was recommended at the age of 16 to an international youth exchange program, which sent me from rural Illinois to Brazil. And there I encountered the radical inclusiveness of Afro-Brazilian deism and animism, and simply could not accept the evangelical condemnation of all non-Christians to hell, after observing these deeply moving and deeply effective relations between humans and their environment. So I declared myself agnostic, returned to the US, made it a hobby to read all the good books of major religions, the Quran, Taoism, all manner of mysticism. And since this was right around the turn of the millennium, there was plenty of new agey garbage to consume. And I also sought out the wisdom of contemplative people, right? And this took me to a meeting with a Tibetan Lama who was living as a refugee in southern Wisconsin. I really liked what I heard. I read everything I could about Mahayana Buddhism, developed a daily practice. I was initiated into the order and invited to become ordained as a nun. I felt then, and I still feel now, that this was a tremendous honor. I saw, the pathway of my life leading down one of contemplation and meditation. But there was one requirement that was really too much for me, and that was the vow of celibacy. Somehow at the age of 18, I had the presence of mind to recognize that if maybe I was skipping some of these Buddhist meetings, Buddhist retreats in a manner that I had spent some of my more fondly remembered high school days, which was to skip class and run off with a handsome fellow student, then perhaps there were other parts of life that I wanted to explore before cloistering myself. It also really didn't make sense to me that the choice was either celibacy and depriving oneself of physical pleasures or delusion and suffering. It didn't make sense to me that one had to give up physical pleasure and ownership of one's own body in order to help save the world. It seemed very Abrahamic, which for me at that point was synonymous with misogynistic. So this biography of my early spiritual life is rather an illustration of both the poverty of science education in the United States, but it's also it also shows the sort of spiritual buffet that's available to a subject of imperial privilege. And all of this, I was driven by a search for truth, right? The promises of enlightenment or eternal life, salvation, these were all a bonus and I couldn't really comprehend them anyway. And in the meantime, I had some fundamental questions about how it all works and why we're all here, and maybe why are we so bad to each other when we could be better? Now, I was in love with Buddhism in this sort of Western New Agey way, but in my first year at university, I took a course on religion and politics in China, and with it went my disillusionment with Buddhism and all organized religions. I learned how, in order to evade taxes, imposed by the emperor, people engaged in tax-exempt donations to monasteries in 12th, 13th, 14th century China, which were then used for all sorts of violent and oppressive ends. This sounded to me an awful lot like the story of Western churches, and so my illusions about Eastern mysticism kind of crumbled somewhat. I then took courses on Islam and learned about the European Crusades in that context, and really washed my hands of organized religion when late one night in my dorm room, it occurred to me, that all major religions had been vehicles of violent conquest, or at the very least served as some sort of psychological pressure valve to help perpetrators ease their consciences. And I'm not claiming that this was anything other than some, cheap and very boring college age epiphany, right? But nevertheless, I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful that it happened. And of course, so then what does the spirit mean? What did this mean? Disavowing religion? Does it mean I had no spirit? I mean, I read Nietzsche, Marx, Foucault, Federici, Mies, and the rest you could say is history, right? God is dead. Religious beliefs intersect with secular forms of total control to produce ideal governable subjects, right? The first ever collaboration between church and state in the history of the Western world was to orchestrate the 4th-century campaign of terror, known as the witch hunts, in order to discipline women out of the public sphere and into unpaid reproductive slavery, so that men would have no choice to leave the home and enter the public sphere as wage slaves, thereby entrenching the political economies of patriarchy that we all know so well. I wanted none of this. I wanted none of the decadent, detestable garbage that comes with religion and so-called spirituality. And so this disavowal of religion was something like a disavowal of one's interior life. And furthermore, and I, as a young blossoming intellectual who happens to be female and identify with a feminine identity, I couldn't help but notice, even though it took me 2 decades to realize this, that I, as a female who pursues knowledge, I'm the original dupe and villain, right? Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So she was the original know-it-all feminist killjoy who ruined the warm bubble of comfortable ignorance one patriarch had created for his male progeny. So when I shed my religious beliefs, a huge weight was lifted. I mean, how could I feel at home in a worldview whose foundational myth was that women suffered because they dared to pursue knowledge, right? So this brief biography, I think, is one that many people who were born in settler colonial contexts and later went through the intellectual formation of critical left scholarship, I think that's a process that many people identify with. But I want to point out a really interesting dynamic here that really only became apparent after I spent some time in China, right? And I want to talk about the transition from deity worship to hierarchy worship, whatever that hierarchy may be. In this case, I'm talking about the state, right? So soon after my disillusionment from Eastern mysticism and Buddhism, I went to China for a year. I went because I wanted to learn Mandarin, and I was too impatient to study it in college, so I took a leave of absence and found a job as a middle school English teacher and went about immersing myself. So although I had declared myself atheist, right, this imprint of a childhood and adolescence of religious programming was still very much there. So less than a decade before, I believed that spreading the gospel and saving souls would solve all the world's problems. And now I was certain that good diplomacy could do that, proper policy, good statecraft, right? So, so my big plan was to go to China, learn Mandarin, and then move on to Arabic and French so that I could work my way up in the UN bureaucracy and, bring about world peace, right? So this was well before the structural and critical theory had really sunk in, right? And I was still looking to hierarchies for some sort of salvation for myself and deliverance for my fellow humans, right? This time, of course, in the form of state and state bureaucracies. And this was an interesting insight to take to China. As an aside, I'll say I really don't think it's a coincidence that as certain forms of organized religion are increasingly tolerated in China, that it just happens to coincide now with China stepping into a certain imperial role and writing its own script of expansionism, ethno-supremacy, and manifest destiny. So where I saw an absence of organized religious dogma, I saw an abundant presence of hierarchy worship and superstition. In a Tibetan household that I visited in the remote Eastern Himalayas a few years later, above most of the household altars, and it's not these images, I couldn't find the sort of standard pink and black posters that were present in the altars above in these Tibetan households. There was an image of Buddha and an image of Mao. So when I finally worked up the courage to ask my Tibetan hosts about it, the head of the household explained that Mao and Buddha are equal. Buddha created the world and Mao created China, and so they worship both. Now, I didn't recall reading any history or Buddhist texts that said that Buddha had created the world, so this struck me as kind of strange. I later learned that Western missionaries had plied the area on and off for centuries with monotheistic creation myths, among many other things. So I felt with some sadness, and I'm ashamed to admit this, also a little bit of derision, that these Tibetans living in China had been totally expropriated of their spiritual history by the anti-Tibetan Chinese state on one hand, and Western missionaries on the other, right? No one I talked to mentioned the Dalai Lama, but Mao and Buddha were elevated to the role of patriarchal creators to provide a common image to which men might subordinate themselves. And I think that it's really this hunger to subordinate oneself. This is learned and violently enforced from childhood for so many of us. I think this is what makes the spiritual question truly inseparable from revolutionary social movements, right? As an important caveat, I'm not going to generate this tendency to subordinate oneself to all of humanity, because I've only observed it in the places that I've traveled, which, however remote and however many they may be, I've only traveled to those places that have been made accessible by centuries of patriarchal imperial conquest, right? So we can't claim that this is human nature. I want to talk a little bit now about the irrepressible nature of interior life, right? I learned something in China that more recent research has come to confirm, and that's a hard truth that informs the framework for this year's conference. People need, for lack of a better term, some sort of interior life, some sort of spiritual life, whatever we want to call it. So people who live to be over 100 have some sort of ritualized community that provides mutual aid. So they're not just physically active, but they are also actively in the business of reaffirming their values among like-minded individuals. So what they are doing is being intentional about drawing their interior life outward. So I think that if we're serious about liberation, whatever that might mean, given our respective contexts, I don't think we can ignore this dimension. The interior life will not be sidelined. I think that interior life will instead be dialectically swept along in the times and spaces in society in which the biological organism of an individual person exists. But when this interior life is articulated at the community level, right, when it's organized into hierarchical religious doctrines and institutions, then it's not necessarily interior life that is swept along, but it's the sort of institutional expression of this interiorized life that then becomes the sweeping force, right? The religious doctrines I think that we're concerned with are not those that are virulently attached to the status quo, right? But rather those which are deeply apocalyptic, that are predicated on a sort of evacuation theology, wherein a sort of perverse turn of logic leads believers to hope for apocalypse so that they can hurry up and get their reward in heaven. Driving around the area here, churches are now advertising apocalypse sermons, apocalypse doctrines, getting ready for the end times, right? Because it provides a framework absent other things, and it provides a welcoming institution absent other welcoming institutions or common spaces where people can express and work through their fears and create something to work forward to. Now, it's these sort of religious doctrines that, of course, justified the indigenous genocide in the European colonial project, and before that, the Crusades, the murder of ethnic others, the expansion of the Holy Roman Empire, and in the US, in contemporary times, evangelical support for the current president and his anti-climate policies is justified, among other things, by beliefs that God is going to destroy the world any day now. So we need to use up that which God gave us. Now, because there's a difference between religious doctrine and spirituality or interior life, we may know this intellectually, but it may also only be something that we can see at a distance. For those who are on the front lines of putting indigenous people in chains, for those who are waving signs at Trump rallies, for young men and women who have fairly uncomplicated feelings about being soldiers in imperialist wars, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that there's not really a difference between religious doctrine and spirituality. And this is what gives religious doctrine its power, right? The fire that it pours into people's hearts and minds with the promise of eternal bliss, right? So that the greater that one sacrifices now, the greater one's eternal reward will be. And so what this does is it renders interior life simultaneously very obvious, inconveniently socially obvious, and politically consequential, but it also remains untouchable and indisputable. So spirituality or interior life is a really funny, kind of irrepressible thing. Its effects are clearly visible in how we relate to each other, how we structure our institutions and assign roles and opportunities based on race, class, sexual expression, and yet it's also untouchable, right? Interior life is impossible to argue for or against because it is untouchable, and yet it is entirely programmable. It is entirely malleable. And I think one aspect where this is abundantly clear is in this process of the interiorization of surveillance practices, which a number of authors have addressed, and for various time reasons I decided not to go into today. Now, I've been trying to identify the really fine-grained processes here that kind of help us make sense of this question of spiritualities in relation to social movements and commenting. And I think the issue is really this, right? It's not necessarily spirituality per se, nor religious doctrine per se that are the cause of so much ill, but it's their specific forms that insist on submission to a hierarchy that simultaneously demands and pardons all things. This hierarchy is institutionalized within or parallel to state power, right? It's expressed often in the language of feudalism. And for people who subscribe to these doctrines, accountability is not with the state except where it's convenient for those in power. Accountability is only with God, who is often depicted as something kind of like Santa Claus on a yoga retreat in California, right? So I'd say that the conscription of interior individual lives has enabled the conscription of so many waking hours of so many human lives. And in the end, it's our waking hours that constitute the terrain of struggle over the meaning and productive purposes of our lives. It's these waking hours during which the irrepressible interior life moves in and out of focus. It's these waking hours that are really the only terrain on which struggle is possible, right? Our way of organizing our waking hours to drive imperialism and fossil-fueled capitalism and industrialism has brought us to our present climate crises. So we need to do something else with those hours. And that something else needs to build a life world that is beautiful and life-giving, that ends the antagonism between production and reproduction. Of course, it's not easy, but neither is the status quo, right? So now we'll move on to the question of time, right? How do we actually organize for decolonization when no one has time? I'll say this, interior life is the one thing that we possess, and time is the one universal currency. Building visions of beautiful commons takes time, and decolonizing has to contend with the difficulties of building social movements and creating spaces of the commons when no one has time. Now, if we must sweat and toil some part of our lives, and if we are sweating and toiling and stressing anyway, why don't we sweat and toil and stress, not for genocide and ecocide, but for pleasure, for integrity, for knowledge and beauty, right? I think this is what we want ultimately with decolonization, even as its local forms will necessarily be different and not necessarily knowable between different forms of decolonization. But I think the common piece is that we want to have our hours, our waking hours. We want to have our interior lives and physical bodies and our relationships to people and planet determined in terms that do not force us into the choice between deprivation or delusion, right? Why not get rid of deprivation and delusion, right? I think this is why we have to think about spirituality or interior life in order to further our efforts to decolonize revolutions, and why thinking about the project of decolonizing is always also a project of strategizing ways to free our bodies in terms of our relationships to people and planet, our interior lives, and the waking hours of our lives. Now, the spatial expression of all of this, the contemplation, the inventory, the history, the social relations, the multiple systems within which we're a part, right, is the commons, right? Now there's a wild variation in the scale and scope of the commons. What I described in the beginning involves sharing the tiniest of seeds, of passing them from hand to hand or through the mail in small envelopes, right? So these tiny seeds are part of a much larger dispersed spatial transformation, which is part of a partial but powerful recommoning of food and autonomy, even as it occurs across multiple forms of land use and land ownership. There's gardens that have been planted in abandoned lots. There's gardens that have been planted in the converted lawns of different institutions. There's gardens that have been planted in churches. There's gardens that people have been growing on their windowsills, on their porches and balconies, and in their own yards. Right? These partial practices together in aggregate constitute a powerful recommoning of autonomy, right? And so here I'm describing a commons built in the context of 21st century capitalism with its social deprivation and ruins and environmental ruins, right? Another variation of the struggle takes the form of reclaiming privatized living spaces or abandoned spaces for collective housing. Right, so this too is a form of commons that's built in the context of 21st century financial capitalism, but it's built out of a necessity for people to live despite abstraction. It's built out of a necessity for people to live despite social deprivation, financialized enclosure, and environmental ruin. So this, like the seeds, is hyperlocal and specific, but because it involves people intentionally rebuilding and creating new lifeways, its significance reverberates through space and time because people are choosing to do something other than serve the machine with their waking hours. Now, many of us are allied with or have encountered community struggles against different forms of primitive accumulation, right? What happens, for example, with collectively held forests, fields, rivers, which have been governed by communities and by customary use practices for centuries. Right, we know that enclosure is an ongoing feature of different forms of industrialization. Now, in my work on the so-called critical material mining and prospecting in different parts of the world, it's this question, the enclosure of the commons, the enclosure of the devaluing of what is on the surface, what sustains life worlds on the surface for digging out the things that come underneath. That is the defining feature of 21st century global resource relations. And this is characterized by the theft of commonly held lands held by non-local others. And this theft could be for elite enjoyment as a site of recreation, or for elite enjoyment as a source of raw materials to be transformed into commodities right? This is the foundational model of economic growth of our age. Now, for the past decade, my work has examined this drive to designate commonly held spaces as new resource-rich frontiers. And for the past 5 years, I've focused on this dynamic with respect to 2 places with particular intensity, indigenous lands in the Amazon and also outer space. Last year, I shared with you my research on the Amazon, and here, since we're talking about the practice of commoning, I want to share with you some of my work on outer space. Outer space is the largest commons there is. And most of us interact with outer space daily, more often than we interact with our own families, through handheld satellite-linked technologies. Outer space is legally designated as the commons. It's governed by the 1967 Treaty on the Principles Governing Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space. It's sort of abbreviated as the OST, the Outer Space Treaty. It was signed by 132 countries, including the United States, Russia, and China. And with this treaty, the international community did something truly remarkable. In 1967, right, in the depths of the Cold War, the OST constituted an agreement to treat outer space in a fundamentally different manner than nearly all other global commons had been treated in the last 500 years. Right, having long foreseen the dangers of remaking outer space into the next frontier for colonization, resource extraction, and militarization, the OST designated outer space as our common heritage and permits only peaceful use in this province of all humankind. So because the OST prohibits claims of sovereignty, quote, by means of use or appropriation or by any other means, this means that outer space is open to all for peaceful exploration and discovery, always, right? This means that you can't plant a flag on a celestial body and call it your own, regardless of what contemporary would-be colonizers might think. This also means that you can't claim finders keepers and then set up a mine to pulverize other worlds into commodities to be sold to the highest bidder, even if you are a US citizen and this is now technically permitted by US law. It most certainly means that you can't turn your space station or lunar base into a military garrison and then threaten to rain down death and destruction on your fellow humans, right? In fact, weapons and the use of force are forbidden in outer space, so it's unclear what, for example, the 2019 US congressional decision to allocate funding to create the Space Force as the 6th branch of the US military really intends to accomplish. And I must mention that in the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the national state of emergency in April of this year, the White House issued an executive order to promote private sector mining of the moon and other planets, right? And also disavowing the existence of outer space as a global commons. So one thing is abundantly clear. The decisions open a sort of Pandora's box of privatizing interests with all of their attendant violence, right? And this Pandora's box of privatization and a resource race and a new frontier mentality, the OST was designed to keep this Pandora's box firmly closed. Now, outer space is the largest commons there is. And perhaps because it is so immense, it helps illustrate with particular clarity the importance of seemingly small-scale actions to protect the commons for all. Now, I could talk about oceans, fisheries, the atmosphere, or polar regions in a fairly similar manner, but the example of outer space really helps illustrate my point. Because when we're thinking about the commons more generally, one of the things that we encounter quite quickly is this tension between the totalizing forces of capitalism and its enclosures and, you know, the relative local scale of our action. And there's a sort of asymmetry here. And this is a source of lots of concern and preoccupation. But I think we need not be overly concerned with this asymmetry. I think we are perhaps, I would posit that we are overly concerned with this asymmetry, perhaps because we've internalized the worship of hierarchies and its sort of size-obsessed chauvinism, right? A result of this is that the very small is often forgotten, right? If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. If you didn't hear about it, it doesn't matter. And the very big is often taken for granted as a sort of monolithic constant. So perhaps we think this way because hierarchical thinking is so baked into our cultural, scientific, and political frameworks that it's scarcely questioned. It's endlessly projected into new domains. It's fiercely defended because historically, for many of us and many of those who survived before us so that we might be here, historically, they have survived because they have submitted to a hierarchy. So returning to outer space then, this sort of, one can very quickly fall into a nihilistic discussion that dismisses the significance of human life because outer space is just so big, right? And these sort of discussions, I think, mirror the pessimistic discussions about the apparent insignificance of local and community actions in the face of the totalizing forces of neoliberalism and techno-capitalism. But I do think that this perspective kind of misses the point. These postulates that the infinity of the cosmos or the enormity of the challenges in front of us obliterates the significance of everyday human actions and the question of whether or not they nourish interior life. I think this reflects the conceit that big equals important and little equals unimportant, right? And I think that this is an example of expansive but very imprecise thinking. The other side of that, right, the rebuttal might be that if humans are not diminished to nothing in the face of the cosmos, then surely we are suffering grand delusions and we're being a little hubristic, right? But whichever one it is, these standpoints have the effect of really shutting down rigorous intellectual activity in the service of preserving or perhaps even exaggerating existing socially produced hierarchies, right? I think these are oversimplifications and they miss the point. The point here is that life, even if we are referring exclusively to human life, it only emerges through the convergence of very large and very small processes, right? So for you to exist here and now, the timing of a heartbeat, the weaving of a DNA strand, the presence or absence of pollutants at a critical moment of your fetal development, all of these are as important as the big world historical currents that we more conventionally study. And who's to say which one is more important, right? Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not proposing that we decouple from either the micro or the macro in order to really appreciate the difference in the size and significance of all things. I'm proposing instead that we think about how we might free ourselves from the worship of hierarchies and maybe set aside a sort of size-obsessed chauvinism whenever we see it cropping up in our own thinking. It's often present in insecurities around when we feel insecurities around the actions that we're proposing to take. When we set these things aside, I would say that we then are able to see the revolutionary power in the act of planting a pepper seed or of refusing to consume new things and instead opting to recycle. And now I'm using intentionally provocative examples that are critiqued in the argument that, look, our big challenges are not about individual action, they're about structural change. What I'm saying instead is that structural change occurs when we decide to allocate the hours of our waking life to beautiful, nourishing, sustainable things, right? Structural change occurs when we figure out how to bring other people with us, or when we find them or find each other and create ways to sustain ourselves and each other, right? So structural change occurs when the person who practices these things decides to, for example, run for office and devote their time to wresting state power away from fascists and authoritarians. So to bring it back to outer space in the final few minutes here and the Amazon, right? The kind of structural change that we want to see needs to have the result of eliminating the various pressures to continuously, quote unquote, discover, enclose, extract, and abandon. right? Speaking in terms of our relationship to natural resources and technology, the status quo is characterized by this dynamic of digging a big hole and building a trash mountain. To bring it back to the question of outer space and the Amazon, the kind of structural change that we want to see has to have the result of eliminating the extractive pressure on Amazon rainforests and their inhabitants so that indigenous communities don't have to choose from a menu of 3 varieties of capitalism in order to survive. By this, I mean, for example, in the areas that I work in, indigenous communities are trying to demonstrate that their presence on the territory is valuable to the state, right? And by value, I mean in very crass economic terms, right? They are engaged in a debate as to whether they can display their value and legitimacy by, say, allowing mining on their territory, by, for example, extracting plant materials to weave baskets to sell to a big box IKEA-like store, or by developing ecotourism enterprises, right? All of these constitute a sort of Faustian bargain with capitalism that endanger their commonly held lands in different ways. With respect to outer space, let's say the kind of structural change that we want to see must have the result of making this extractive colonial drive to militarize and privatize outer space simply irrelevant, right? The latest move to privatize and enclose the cosmos is simply the latest in the capitalist imperialist mode of resource discovery, enclosure, exploitation, and abandonment. And one clear way that we slow this down is by changing the practices that create an artificial resource scarcity in the first place, right? So that the drive, the outward expansive drive loses some of its fuel, right? We could, for example, do what folks who are involved in commoning are really, really great at doing, which is look at the spaces of waste and valorize them. We live in a time of ruin, but also of tremendous abundance. And the trick of the totalizing project of imperialist and capitalist enclosure is to turn our abundance into waste, to enclose and deprive, so that not only resources, but also people are wasted. And so, for example, one mundane, concrete expression of this sensibility would simply be figuring out how to recycle our discarded electronics. Now, the practices that I've described here are small and they're concrete, but they're decisive. But as I said at the beginning, their value and their impact is unlikely to be completely and totally known until one morning we wake up and the world is a different place. So I'll wrap up this section with a metaphor, taken from my experience of now living on the coastal plain of Delaware, which is saturated with water. So not only is it vulnerable to sea level rise, this peninsular area here, but it is also slowly sinking back into the Atlantic Ocean since the retreat of the ice sheets at the end of the last ice age. This area is saturated with water. It's sinking into the ocean. It's vulnerable to sea level rise. And so I think the image or the metaphor that I want to give you is that of a flood. Now let's think about how floods happen. Thinking about how floods occur incrementally allows us to take lessons from catastrophe and their physical operations. This allows us to take lessons from what we see happening with climate change. When it rains a lot, puddles form. When there's nowhere for the puddles to go, when the ground is saturated, when the rain keeps falling, the puddles flow together, right? The waters rise and join until they wash away what was there before. And by this, I want to say that small scale actions become large scale actions when the small scale actions are pervasive and relentless. Qualitative change becomes quantitative change when small qualitative changes are pervasive and relentless. So we might then think that in this a time of apocalypse fatigue, what is the role of interior life when the planet is at stake? And when I say the planet is at stake, what I'm truly concerned with are the beautiful, pleasurable, and sensual life worlds that help things grow. It's that spark the fire of neurons in the formation of new knowledge in an individual mind. Let us never dare to speak of the macro without always also speaking of the micro, and vice versa. So we're here in a moment of catastrophe, and yet also we have all survived. After enduring the pain of losing unborn children, I'm acutely aware of the power of survival and in awe that any of us are here to begin with. So what really is the role of interior life when the planet is at stake? What might it mean in practice to place social movement spiritualities and commenting on the same plane of theory and practice? So I don't want to end here on some trite note about how the power is within us and it's been there all along, right? About how the moment of possibility is here, about how we're already doing the work and that's great, right? I don't want to repeat some garbage about how we can build whatever world we want and do some stupid thought exercise where we picture a beautiful world, right? Who has time for that? Instead, I would rather end on a serious note about how the power is within us, that the moment of possibility is here, and about how we're already doing the work. I want to be serious about this. I'd like to end on the serious note that we can build whatever we want as long as we do the work. So we'll conclude with a serious thought exercise in which we'll attempt to imagine a beautiful world in a specific way. It's very important that we at least give ourselves time for that. So even if this is uncomfortable, remember there's lessons in discomfort and we can allow at least 2 minutes for imagination. So why don't you take 30 seconds, stand up, stretch, take a deep breath, and then sit back down so we can wrap this up. Yeah, there we go. Excellent. Good, thank you. Okay, so I'd like you to imagine that when you walk out of wherever you're at, in a few minutes time, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, you walk out and you look at the world and you find we've won. The world that we want and all the changes that involves, somehow it happened. Now, maybe you can't let yourself believe it tonight, right? Maybe you'll have a glass of wine or some beers, maybe you'll dance, maybe you'll sleep soundly. But then when you wake up tomorrow, you'll see that it really is true. We really have won. There's no more decolonizing left to do. There's no more fighting. Imagine what you would do tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., 10, lunchtime, 2 p.m. And I wonder how different is what you're imagining from what you're planning to do tomorrow already. So maybe you're naysaying the whole exercise, right? I want to say that naysaying is easy. It's self-protective. When you're naysaying, all you have to do is not take risks. And we're all tired sometimes, but making naysaying a habit is kind of lazy, and you are not lazy. Maybe you're thinking about how inane this question is, because if you, like me, imagine victory involving a fossil fuel-free world, maybe you're thinking through the logistical challenges of going about your plans for tomorrow in that sort of context of victory, rather than one within the status quo, right? Instead of using that line of reasoning to interrupt your own vision and censor your own thoughts, I would propose that you instead use it to get specific about what victory looks like in its everyday form. And I'm really interested in knowing what those specific aspects are, right? What are the logistics of the decolonial mode of life? How does it actually work where you're at? Start with you, start with where you're at, here and now. Maybe you're also thinking about how much more you would need to learn to, for example, just even see or be able to imagine what victory might look like. Victory is also maybe the wrong word. We all know this, right? The process of learning to see violent processes for what they are, rather than natural or normal, is a painful process. The ugly truths that we must confront about ourselves, each other, our societies, these are all really painful. I know I'm acutely aware of how much more I must learn, but think, who are you actually as a decolonial person? And what does your decolonial community look like? Where are you and who is with you? And how does the air smell and feel on your skin? I think finally, maybe you're thinking or realizing that if you walk out of here and we've won, and you wake up tomorrow and you see that it's true, maybe you're thinking that what you would do is not so different from what you'll be doing anyway. That doesn't mean that the struggle is pointless. That doesn't mean that the status quo is okay. It means that your beautiful vision is maybe a lot closer than we generally imagine. So I'm interested in hearing from you what this looks like in detail. You may want to start by defining it negatively, right? There's no violence, no racism, no theft of time. It's okay and understandable that we start there in the negative, but a new world is not built on negative space and negative reasoning alone. The challenge, I think, is to try and begin to use affirmative language, right? That actually allows us to flesh out the details and to find the pleasure in those details and to direct our waking hours toward that, right? To give that beautiful dream life and then to let it direct us during our waking hours. So let's discuss. Questions and comments and ideas are all welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that really beautiful talk. There are already some questions. Yeah, I wanted to say something, but my brain just went blank. Yeah, I wanted to say that I think everything you said, it was really, for me at least, it showed all the lot of work that we have to do in ourselves to become people, to decolonize ourselves as well, to be able to create a decolonial world, I guess, if that makes any sense. That was what I was thinking. And I really love that both last year and both now, you made very practical, almost exercises to do that, which I think, at least for me, it's really important and helpful. And it almost makes me hopeful. So that's also cool. So I'm gonna read you a question at a time. I guess that's gonna be the easiest. So from Raluca Grosescu, I like a lot that you talk about biographical positioning, but how do you see biographical accounts in relationship with epistemic production? You have to unmute yourselves, sorry.
Classic. I think the more time I spend on Zoom, the less savvy I am. I think that so I'm largely in agreement with the body of critical scholarship that sees epistemic production and knowledge production as inseparable from one's own positionality. But I think the challenge is, we're living as we live in and are formed as subjects in a process that alienates us from ourselves and normalizes our relationship to violent processes. I think the ongoing challenge is to identify the ways in which one's own production of self actually shape one's own processes and practices of knowledge production. And the radical ongoing standpoint of this as a continuous, imperfect, flawed process involves, I think, also the requirement to confront the errors that one recognizes in one's past work, right? Which we see some of, but I don't think we see enough of it. And also to actually do the work of thinking through, okay, there's an erroneous claim. What made that claim possible, right? And to speak not only to one's own errors in reasoning that come from or result from one's position. And here I'm speaking generally, but what I have in mind is, the position of a privileged individual engaged in the paid enterprise of knowledge production. right? Which is an extraordinarily privileged position. It's not just a matter of mea culpa, but it's also a matter of doing the work to analyze the larger structures and historical processes that make such errors in reasoning, thought, interpretation, and knowledge production possible, right? So it's ongoing and it's super uncomfortable at times, but I think that in discomfort, there is a lot of good information.
Yeah, thank you. Also from Raluca Grosescu, how to develop a methodology that really reflects relationship between biography and epistemic production.
Yeah, I like this. I like that it's a methodological question. So I think that there are really excellent examples out there that are already being normalized or have been normalized for a long time in critical feminist and subaltern studies, right? Where we make it a habit to state our positionalities and our relationships to the topic at hand at the outset. Of course, this has been critiqued as performative at times and essentializing, and that's all true, right? But I think that the goal is not perfection, the goal is honesty, right? And to make it, so from a methodological standpoint, I guess there's a couple of things that immediately come to mind. For me, in my own experience, I've been, one of the things that I've noted in 15 years of doing ethnographic research in different parts of the world, which includes also returning home to the Midwest at times, is this sense that as one is in the process of ethnographic research and engagement, one is also in a process of feeling and observing oneself in an acute sort of hyper-aware way, right? To use maybe an image that we're all really familiar with right now, it's like you're watching yourself, you're feeling yourself do research much in the way that when we're using Zoom, you're kind of watching yourself talk, right? It's a little uncomfortable. It can be. But also from a methodological standpoint, I think that it's really important to learn from the canon of literatures that have insisted that knowledge is partial, imperfect, and situated, and to find within that literature and within those examples a practice that actually works for you and is specific to the research and the work that you do, right? So typically, I will say that the example of, or I want to say what I really want to say, because talking about my own history was deeply uncomfortable here, and I'm aware of the absurdity of it, speaking English to a village in Romania about my history in the Midwest, right? I don't think that's the model. I don't think the model is taking up the middle space of whatever you have to say with something about yourself, except for when that is the work to be done, right?
Yeah, I really like this way of thinking, that there are a lot of things that are comfortable and we have to do it, but kind of doing it with an analytical mindset and rather than an emotional, even though it's obviously an emotional work. As you said, there's a lot of shame involved and a lot of, but actually we are as, sorry, as a moderator, I'm talking, but I just had this thought that we are kind of like our brains are colonized and we have to get it out of there. And that is an analytical work. That is a work.
Yeah, it is. And I think we can be a little bit more careful with the distinction between analytical and emotional, right? That it's not, like, we want to be careful wherever we see these dualisms and dualities, right? It's not necessarily the sort of Cartesian divide.
Yeah, all right.
But it's moving like through different modes of knowledge and experience.
Oh, cool. Okay, next one from Juana Marin. I can't affirm enough how important it is to initiate and be together in these vulnerable conversations about religion and spirituality, to pause inside them. And it feels important to be as intentional about what we call organized religion as we are about what we call decoloniality. Does it take place in a particular building with a particular liturgical hierarchical order? Is it necessarily dogmatic, doctrinal? Can it be 3-4 people gathering to hold a space together? Can it be a spontaneous communion out of whatever food there might be lying around? Or sitting in silence online with other Quakers during a pandemic? For theological conversations in the US, for example, the liberal left is rarely exposed to rich histories of the hush harbors of the enslaved, the critical and prophetic preaching tradition of Black women, liberation, Black and womanist theologies, unless one arrives via this circuit searching not only to non-Christian forms of spirituality, which seem nearly an inevitable path for those of us wish. Is that all? Sorry.
While you're looking for the rest of the question, I'll say just first, thank you so much. This is a really great and important question. My own training as a geographer means that I'm very attentive to material and spatial forms. So when I'm talking about, in this case, when I'm talking about organized religion, I'm talking about a specific sort of building and a specific sort of ritualized practices. And that is distinct from people gathering a couple at a time spontaneously, right? And I also want to emphasize that in my critique, I'm critiquing certain forms of organized religion that assume these specific spatial forms and are oriented toward not the preservation of the status quo, but a sort of apocalyptic evacuation theology, right? And it's the work of this particular form of organized religion that, demands but also pardons all things, that I'm critiquing here. That is not at all to erase the beautiful things that come out, right? Sort of as Mark said, it's right. There's religion as a form of expression of human suffering, right? As a thing that people seek for refuge, and then there's sort of organized religion as a thing that sort of obfuscates our relationships to each other and the planet.
Okay, so I'll just read the rest of it, right?
Sure. Thanks.
So there was I'll start it. For theological conversations in the US, for example, the liberal left is rarely exposed to rich histories of the hush harbors of the enslaved, the critical and prophetic preaching tradition of Black women, liberation, Black and womanist theologies, unless one arrives by the circuitous searching not only to non-Christian forms of spirituality, which seem nearly an inevitable path for those of us wishing to disavow the violence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but plumbing exactly the uncomfortable, unapologetic Christian spaces that have formed our patterns of thought, relational values, and bodily orientation in time and space. This does not require blind faith, collusion with or self-harm in sites of violence, but radical attention to and presence alongside the places where people are making life, much like Paula Meehan's grandmother. Thank you for your vulnerability, and I only wish to encourage further conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those insights. Yeah.
Sorry. And another one from Juana Marin. Engaging this playful provocation seriously, I see at present multiple moves from trauma-organized carceral to trauma-informed and eventually to care-centered communities. Christina Bethel.
Excellent. I'd like to hear more about this. Like, what specifically? What's the example? Right. One of the things that, I'm happy to do the Q&A freely, but one of the things that I'd like to see and hear is, this sort of specific examples. Like, what does this look like? What do you have in mind? What's the example?
Cool. So maybe Juana could write us in an email or on YouTube if you suppose. Anyone from Zoom? I think that was all on YouTube. Yeah, Manuela?
Yes. Thank you so very much, Julie. It's a treat, and it was a tour de force on many levels. I'm always listening, of course, with a view to capturing a bit of what is closer to what I know best. So thinking about the way you used autonomy and sovereignty to talk about how growing your own food and planting seeds gives you, you said sweet sovereignty, which I think is a very, very interesting pairing of words, right? We don't usually associate any sensory kind of adjective to sovereignty. But then my guess is that you also mean something very different that what we normally mean when we speak about state sovereignty, because obviously this is a very state critical approach. And then when you talked about autonomy, it was similar. It was the those who are aware of the necessity of growing their own food become autonomous. Now that autonomy and that sovereignty, how would you differentiate them from decoloniality?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I want to emphasize, I think I said a taste of sweet sovereignty, and I want to emphasize the taste, right? Because these moments as these moments where you're growing your own food, or you're building collective living spaces, or you're putting your body on the line, or reallocating your hours to something that involves sustaining yourself and your communities independent of larger circuits of capitalist accumulation, or within them and not entirely legible to them. That's a moment where I think one sees how the world can be otherwise, and also sees the possibility of what that decolonial world might look like, right? I think one of the outcomes of the really robust literature and analysis around the question of sovereignty of the territorial nation state is that and in the hard work that people do to understand it and think about it, is that, it can be really difficult when we're doing that work to take a moment and think about what sovereignty means and feels like for the self, right? And I don't mean this in the sense of like, a man is an island or whatever, right? But sovereignty in the sense of one is capable and able and supported, and able to determine in a sort of symbiotic collaboration what we will do with our waking hours to sustain ourselves. And when I mentioned, and thank you for pointing attention to the part where I said when people become aware of the necessity of growing their own food, then they begin to become autonomous. I think that one of the really important steps of decoupling oneself from the machine in its various forms is that initial awareness of the importance of and the beauty and the dignity of labor for oneself, right? And so when it comes to, for example, for an urbanized subject, an urbanized imperial subject, where the process of acquiring food to maintain oneself involves this convoluted process of selling one's labor in exchange for money in order to buy something that's produced who knows where, right? That shift in awareness to the necessity and the ability to grow one's own food is like a first step toward stepping outside of and orienting one's waking hours away from the maintenance of a sort of capitalist imperialist machine. Now that is always partial, right? So the COVID cooperative gardens, for example, are operating within and across and using a number of platforms that that already exist, right? And so in addition to the flow of seeds, in order to make the flow of seeds possible, not only has there needed to be a flow of envelopes and stamps, but also a flow of money to support people who are living in an occupied reclaimed house in Philadelphia, so that they can be a central seed clearinghouse and do this work, right? And so at this point, I think I can only personally, but also empirically say that the experience of sovereignty and autonomy is partial and incomplete, but it is a very sweet taste of the kind of world that we want, right?
Thank you. If there's no other question right now, can I add something maybe? Oh, there is a question.
Yeah. You have to unmute yourself.
No, go first, Manuela.
Okay,
Continue.
just quickly, because as you were talking, I was thinking that sounds a lot like feminist subsistence theory that you also mentioned briefly when you said, well, I've also read Mies. Nobody reads Mies in Europe. I know in the US it's more common, but still not as common as it should. So it sounds to me like we could have had this conversation or we could have mainstreamed this conversation 30 years ago, but not enough people were listening. Would you see it like that? Or would you say, no, wait, okay, this was the 70s and feminist subsistence theory were still too Marxist and I'm engaging the outer space to complicate it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I don't really have a sense of how much Mies is read in different parts of the world, kind of comparatively. But I think what I will say is that, you know, people took it really serious. There were some people who took it really seriously in the 70s, and they reorganized their lives according to that ideal. And they created things that were not prescribed, right, by this capitalist political economy in which they live, right? And so I think because of the necessary, like the sort of necessary tension between like the larger scale question of the commons and enclosure and the actual terrain of engagement, right, which is local and maybe not always well documented and often necessarily secret. You know, I guess for me, it's hard to say. But for my part, I think, you know, and this kind of speaks to the methodological question that came up earlier. I think that that there is power in these ideas whenever they are encountered, even if they're not encountered, you know, decades or centuries after they're initially written. And so the question of how many people are paying attention and all of that, I think that we're disciplined to think that way because of the enterprise we're in and the incentive structures that we have. But I think when it comes to the question of praxis and building life worlds that sustain us and our biospheres, I guess I'll take a risk and say it doesn't really matter how many people are paying attention, right? Which is why this moment of comparing strategies across locations is so important, right?
A video?
Oh, I also forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Julie. This was very inspiring. And thank you first from speaking from your vulnerabilities. I very much believe in the power of and in this as a task that we have to keep on doing. And for engaging in decolonial pedagogy here, not just stating, but putting the work in to understand and define your positionality, including our complicities and implications, as well as resources for liberation. And where this process led you tonight to present us a genealogy of, I guess, Western, but not only Western hierarchical thought, which is also classificatory thought, right? And that has as the master enunciator the white supreme self. And that practice led you to see places where you can cross over and see, as you said, the beauty in the small and the power of the small. But people do this crossover or this defining when they do this decolonial exercise in reaching out towards their different moments of being and defining positionalities, they have different resources, right? And you started by showing a little bit, helping us or learning to see the ruins of capitalism and the end of the modern world and the resistances. And then you kind of, and this is where my question would come in, you kind of stop short, you talked about the commoning and the common. But one thing are the commons, and a different thing is the communal. Just as one thing is resistance, and a different thing is communalizing, right? And so, as I was saying, with people defining different positionality, they also have different resources that they find for liberation. For some people, the communal self is cut off. For some, they have immediate relation to ancestral land, to ancestral tradition. From some others, the communal self is atrophied or pressured, reduced to nothingness. So I was wondering then, how do you see this beyond resistance, this work of decolonizing ourselves, reaching towards not only commoning, but developing the communal?
Thank you for that. I think that one of the things that, okay, there's three things I want to say, and I'm just putting them in order here, classificatory ordering. The first thing I'll say is, this sort of exploring one's own positionality, I think also involves, for someone who is a well-meaning white female in a settler colonial context, confronting the impossibility of one's own positionality, right? It's especially apparent in new ways endlessly as struggles for various forms of liberation continue to evolve. Most recently in the United States, there's been a lot of work around, and I think this is an indicator of a certain and important sort of progress. There's been a lot of work around white people doing the work within white communities in order to bring about anti-racism, right? And that's important. But one of the things that's become very clear is, well-meaning white people tend to experience or engage with racism as primarily on the emotional level. It's abstract, right? And so, I've been in a number of these events where it's primarily white people, but there's also Black men and women who may be present. And the experience of hearing white people express their anguish about racism on primarily emotional terms, how hard it is to talk to their racist uncle or relative, for example, is traumatizing. Because what it does is it reinscribes the difference between people who experience racism as an abstract thing that they worry about versus people who are confronting the lethal reality of it on a daily basis. And so I would say that when people, the only thing I can say from my own experience is that this sort of decolonial exercise of thinking through and crossing over, I don't think necessarily that it leads to resolution. I think that it leads to an awareness of certain impossibilities, right? Which is where the thought exercise of actually thinking through, well, okay, what would it look like for these impossibilities to not be here anymore? Like what sort of minute actions, 1 hour to the next, like what minute everyday actions are necessary for us to wake up one morning for that reality to no longer be. But then, so that's kind of the first thing. And then, but yeah, to the point that I think this also speaks to the point that people have very different resources for liberation, and that people are seeking to liberate themselves from very different things. And that there is a fairly apparent contradiction here, right? This has been manifest in my own work in the fact that, look, as the US, for example, seeks to implement something that looks like a Green New Deal so that we can liberate ourselves from the intensifying consequences of climate change and fossil fuel dependence, that clashes directly with certain indigenous peoples in certain places dreams for sovereignty and independence and freedom from violence, because they happen to be living atop resource endowments. And so when we run into an impossibility, a contradiction like this, right, that's the key moment for the structural analysis, right? But I think the challenge is to not stop at the structural analysis and then to say, okay, what does the structural analysis tell us about what we can do, right, with this block of time, with that block of time, in order to resolve this contradiction, right? And that points our attention to the mundane. And that actually is where I think there's this question of people having different resources and different sensibilities for what liberation might actually mean. It's where if we can be okay with the conflict and the discomfort, we can get through to the mundane agenda setting side of thing. And the thing is, mundane agenda setting is not a very glorious goal, which is why I think often we don't get there, right? We want to be in the space of the heady thoughts and the adrenaline of the fight and the socialist realist painting of resolution or what have you, or revolution. But I think now then to speak to the third point or question of, the difference between the commons and communing. And how do we see beyond resistance? One of the things that has really frustrated me about the political discourse in the US in the last 4 years, but certainly beyond that, is, and I think in contrast to things like the ZADs, like the defense zones that we see in France and other places, is that the posture of resistance reifies that which is being resisted against. It is a reactive posture. It's a sort of saying like, well, you get it. I'm not going to go into it, but but I think the real challenge, or I think before I get into the challenge, I'll talk about the allure of resistance. I think the thing that makes resistance so appealing is that it's an end in itself. Yes, it is important, but there is not within it, at least how it is expressed in contemporary US politics, a mandate to then create something worth defending. Right. And I think one of the biggest errors of the sort of liberal human rights discourses and the cosmopolitanism that comes with that is this sense that, for example, once a law is passed, this is part of, like, you know, the progressive arc of history, and that law or these conventions or these protections can simply defend themselves. Good job, we all did it. Let's have a nice celebratory dinner, move on to the next thing, right? And so I think also that dynamic really complicates this whole question of moving from creating a physical space that is a commons, and then actually engaging in the really difficult social work that is communing, right? So I talked about Occupy in the talk, I'll use that as an example here. You know, there was this beautiful moment in Oakland where everyone was out on the streets, right? You had folks from all walks of life. You had strollers and militants pushing strollers and all sorts of really beautiful, there was a moment, right? And because the collective process for figuring out what form resistance would take, because that process broke down, then the majority of the people who were present, who were there, who had come out in this show of solidarity and force, were alienated and driven away, right? And then also ridiculed. And so I think that the key ingredient to moving from the creation of a commons to actually the practice of communing is time and emotional investment. And that requires a very different relationship to time than we're socialized to have. Because the democratic process is involved in communing and expressed in various anarcho-syndicalist practices and all of that stuff, it takes a lot of time. And in fact, the most glib arguments against democracy and democratic governance are that it is inefficient and it takes too long and you can't get things done. Okay. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that and for this whole talk and for all the discussion. And I think I'm gonna give the word to Adina. Okay.
Right. Also, thank you so much. It means this is the most meaningful conference that I've ever been involved in. And since my time with you all last year, it's fundamentally changed the way I think about everything. And if we were there together, we would have long meals and long walks to talk about it, right? And in fact, were we not in the midst of a pandemic, I think, Manuela, you would have been nearby in Baltimore, like earlier this year, right? So there's a number, this moment is fleeting, but it is deeply meaningful. And I thank you so much for organizing and putting the resources together to make it possible and giving your time and intellectual and emotional energy to it.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Julie. And I wanted to a little bit conclude together. But before that, saying some of us something, if you want. I also wanted to say that we had 2 days of very intelligent presentation, and I was really, really happy. I'm very tired also, so I hope I can say I can stay to the end. Also, I would like to thank to the members of our team that help us a lot during these days. We manage, I don't know, we changed so many times. So at the end, we decided that we can't do it, the conference there. So for us, it was also very sad moment to not to be there, because we struggled at the end to manage to be there, but unfortunately we couldn't do it. So I mentioned Adina Marincea, Raluca Țurcănașu, Cristian Grecu, Emil Flora, Vlad Gheorghiu. Adina and Raluca help us a lot with communication. Vlad and Emil help us with logistics. Cristian Grecu help us with the visual things, brochures, posters, and everything. Gabriela Herza, which is on Romuli, and Andrei. We say hello to Andrei. Andrea Midgivi, which is not here, but she contributed to our project. A special thanks to Anastasia, Ábrán, and Ágota, who help us a lot during with the conference. I mentioned here Valer. Too, even though he was a little absent lately, so we hope that next time he will recuperate. I'm very happy to our scientific board, especially to Manuela, to you, Julie, to Ovidiu, for all this help and the constructive comments during all the organizing moments. Even though we are not in Telciu, I would like to thank Valeriu Henciu alias Uku, who helped us many times when we're in the village. I don't want to forget to thank to our sponsors and partners, Telciu City Hall and Village Council, Lucian Blaga University of Sibiu, also to Fredrik Albert Stiftung Foundation, also to the University of Freiburg and the museum from Zalău. And if I forgot something, please tell me. And if you want to say something and to conclude together, it will be perfect. So I'm really grateful to all of you, and thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Adina, too.
Thank you, Adina.
And see you in Telciu next year, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Adina. Thanks to all of you. And it was a beginning of decolonizing revolutions. There's more work to do. So maybe we'll keep at least the main title. Ovidiu and I were like brainstorming about it today, because it was a bit of a reduced edition, also because it's online. I mean, as we know, the most important conversations do not take place in the Q&A or during the talks, as important as they are, but we should be at Hovra now, and we can't. And so we have to both keep exploring the topic and give it more space and time. As we learned, time is of the essence. So I think that next year, given that it's going to be the anniversary edition, it's the 10th, there isn't a better or a bigger topic than decolonizing revolutions, unless we do something on outer space that would be more macro than the macro. But we can all brainstorm about that, I guess.
I also wanted to say that it's very important that in the following years to have something more in Romanian. We are aware of that, so it's good, and we will think more about to have more things in Romania, even though we were doing online. So yes, then the following years it will be good to have it in Romanian, because we don't have a vocabulary and we don't have sometimes these concepts, and it will be helpful because we're traveling around the world and we are speaking so many languages, and then we are coming back. When we are coming back to our own languages, it's so frustrating to manage all these concepts.
I think it really has to do with how we engage also with each other and with the topic. And it is good to open it up to a big audience, but at the same time, if so many Romanian speakers are participants, there should be a space that makes space for that. And I know there are several formats that we can use, but I think having this virtually made it more difficult, because how do you, of course you can separate a virtual room and move the conversations there, but actually missing the actual space where to separate and maybe conflate some of the conversations and realize when it's time to switch to Romanian, that was not there, because we were floating around in ether. So really hoping that we can have a physical meeting next year. And I'm already at Hovra, as you can see, so come over, everyone.
So before we join you there at Hovra, I want to give a special thanks to Adina, who coordinated the conferences this year together with Ágota. Also to everyone who participated with their very interesting topics and presentation, for giving their work and their time to this, and to everyone who has commented and interacted with us. And also, I think besides just wanting to be in Telciu, we should maybe spare a thought for the community there, and try to think in tune with everyone we have interacted with. And that's all from my part. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Me too. So, and see you next year, perhaps.
Yes.
Thank you. It's difficult to leave. I want to go get a beer with everyone now.
Oh yeah, that would be so cool.